Yes. Okay, whenever you are ready. We good? Okay, I'm assuming
Wendy?
we're good.
It's all being broadcast.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the March Science Lecture sponsored by the Friends of the Pine Bush. Our mission, the Friends of the Pine Bush community is committed to working with the Albany Pine Bush Commission to provide support and opportunities for the public to participate in activities that contribute to stewardship and appreciation of the unique natural communities found in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. I'm Don Allard. I'm a member of the board of the Friends of the Pine Bush. And if you are already a friend, thank you. And if you have been considering becoming a friend, please see me after, or just go on to the Pine Bush website, and you'll find avenue to become a friend of the Pine Bush. Or see me after the lecture. We'll be having the third annual research symposium on Wednesday, April 26th, from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. This symposium is a special edition of our bi-monthly science lecture series. The evening will highlight many of the research projects conducted in the preserve by students, professors, and local scientists, past and present. Researchers will present their findings through posters, and attendees will have the opportunity to speak to researchers directly about their work. So it'll take place in this room here, Pine Barrens room, and also in the museum area outside. And with that, I'll give it to our preserve conservation biologist, Steve Campbell, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Did you mention the exits?
I did before.
All right. Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Corbin, who's a professor of biological sciences at Union College. He's a native of the San Francisco Bay Area, and he comes to us by way of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he did his graduate work, and University of California at Berkeley, where he did his postdoc work looking at species invasions and restoration. He got to Union College in 2006, where he continues to study how human activities affect ecosystems and how then we can help them restore the ecosystems that we've then since degraded. We've been fortunate that he's chosen to do some of his research here in the preserve. He's helping us better understand the Pine Barrens ecosystems and their dynamics, and how our attempts to restore these ecosystems are working. More recently, he and one of his students, who I guess is here, has kind of looked outside of the Pine Bush to say, where else in New York State can we potentially look into restoring these Pine Barrens ecosystems? And that's what he's here to talk to about today. So let's welcome Dr. Corbin.
Thank you, Don. Well, it's great to be here. I am a member of the Friends of the Pine Bush board, so I definitely want to echo what Don said about encouraging you to please join that if you don't already. I'm going to start with some acknowledgments and introductions. So first, my co-author here, Emma Flatland, really pioneered most of the analysis that you're going to see here today. And then some of the other people that I want to thank, especially at the New York Natural Heritage Program, Tim Howard, Greg Ettinger, and Steve Young were really instrumental in helping us with data for the project. Steve and Neil Gifford helped me really for years better understand this ecosystem and its place within the rest of the region, including New York. And then some other folks over there on the right side, Chris Bulow, Brian Hawthorne, both with state wildlife offices in Massachusetts, Rachel Theat, who's a colleague with whom I've worked on Pine Barrens and Sandplains in the Northeast, and then Union Professor Don Rodbell helped me understand something about the historical context of what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to begin with a little kind of audience participation here. You're all here, I hope, because you really love and appreciate the pine bush. But what makes it unique? So what is it about the pine bush that makes it unique? I'm gonna wait.
The geology,
The geology specifically, what do you mean by that?
well, just the way it was formed with the receding glaciers, depositing, you know, or actually creating sand from the bedrock, however that happens, and that there in turn, you know, at some point, maybe having a different fauna and flora than the surrounding area.
Great. What else? What other things make the pine bush really unique and special?
It hasn't been developed.
It's wild, it's undeveloped, great point. That'll definitely come up as we talk here today. What else?
Sandy soils are nutrient poor.
The biologists here, what's unique about it as far as the biology of what we have? It's really different from what you find in Catskills, right? I mean, so, you know, the real answer that I'm going to be focusing on here today is the one that Don identified first and that you mentioned. It's really the sand. That sand is the foundation for what has made the pine bush special. Sand plus the regular disturbances through fire have really created a very unique ecosystem here at the pine bush and in other kinds of habitats like this. So as we all know, I think pine barrens and sand plains, the Albany pine bush being one of them, is a globally rare ecosystem that has a really unique physical structure and also biota compared to what we find elsewhere in New York State. So the typical ecosystem is you know, widely scattered trees, pitch pines, for example, and either a shrubby or a grassy understory. And they exist on these very deep, very sandy soils that really were laid down by glacial activity, just like Don said. And then along with periodic disturbances that clear out species, the vegetation once in a while, maintain open areas or mechanical burning, mechanical activities through cutting, if through some of the more recent forms of habitat management, can keep this area open and keep that physical structure that supports the unique species that you find here. So we're all very familiar with the Albany pine bush. The otherwise, probably the best known outside of the capital region is the New Jersey pine barrens. But there are also other locations scattered along the Atlantic coastline, including Cape Cod and Long Island and up into Maine, and interior, the interior Northeast as well, in Maine and New Hampshire and elsewhere in New York. And so these ecosystems, these pine barrens and sandplains often occur hundreds of miles from each other. They can be long distances away, very isolated, but they also host a variety of really rare and often threatened biota. So plants, birds, insects, amphibians, a variety of different species that you find here that you don't find anywhere else. They're different from the otherwise kind of moist forests that we find throughout the rest of New York and the rest of Northeast. And so as a result, they're really significant areas for biodiversity and have been a great focus of conservation efforts. But these ecosystems used to be a lot more extensive in area in terms of where we find them in the Northeast than they are today. So one estimate is that only about half of the pine barrens and sandplains that were that existed at the start of the 20th century are still in existence today. A lot of them, with the advent of fire suppression, other species, trees in particular, were able to come in and really close up the canopy and crowd out the native shrubs, the native wildflowers and such that you find in the more open, well-managed ecosystems. And then, as no surprise to those of us here, but the development is another key threat, has been another way. So here at the Albany Pine Bush, the construction of houses and businesses the fragmentation by roads and railroads, the thruway, among others, has really taken a lot of the historical area and paved it over. Agriculture as well. So agriculture has also taken over a lot of this as well. And so that's really been part of what has led to these ecosystems being threatened in the plants and animals that live here. So in really what I'm going to talk to you about today is our efforts to try to though understand a little bit more about what the potential distribution of these ecosystems are. Not just what do we have today, but really what were they more like in the past? What did our region look like? And where did you find these in New York and elsewhere in the Northeast? That helps us understand their ecology better, but it also really helps us understand how to manage them and potentially where could we potentially try to restore areas back to support the plants and animals here that live here and really don't live in other types of forests. As I said, these ecosystems really only occur on these very deep sandy soils, and that's the basis of their rarity. They're unable to grow in areas of the Northeast that don't have these open conditions, that don't have these sandy soils and the periodic disturbances. And by deep sandy soils, I mean really deep, like tens of meters deep. And they formed from either the glacial moraines that formed at the kind of the ends of the glaciers as they push down in the coastal areas, but our inland glaciers and the lake beds that formed as the glaciers retreated formed those similar conditions here inland, like here in Albany. So the goal for Emma's project and my project that I'm describing here were really twofold. So one, we wanted to understand the soils conditions of the areas that we know harbor high quality habitat in our region, and then apply that to try to understand where else do we find those conditions, regardless of what they are today, regardless of what kinds of vegetation, what kinds of biota they have now. Could they, potentially support them? Do they have the soils that match that? And so that our hope then is that will, like I say, help us understand what were these ecosystems like in the past, but also then show us what the potential would be in the future if we wanted to try to expand their area. So the first thing that we did in order to try to do this is that we used New York Natural Heritage Program classifications of communities. So they have classified the natural ecosystems of New York State, and there were 27 of them that are related to the Albany pine bushes and other of these types of habitats. So for example, coastal oak forests and maritime grasslands, heathlands, and forests that you find in Long Island and other coastal places. Pitch pine oak forest, pitch pine heathlands like we find here, that with scrub oak in the understory or blueberries in the understory, and successional grasslands and heathlands. Those are some examples of the kinds of ecosystem types that the New York Natural Heritage Program has classified and mapped as to where they are in the state. So then we mapped the 156 known locations of those appropriate ecosystems. And so this map right here, if you're squinting and you're saying, well, I can't really see anything there, Jeff, that's kind of the point, is that the area of the known pine barren and sandplain ecosystems here are very small. They're really almost like pinpricks on this map. So there's the Albany pine bush right there. There's Wilton, and there's some other green on Long Island, but otherwise we just have very, very small points on there. But that's the data that we have to work with. That's really what we have, and kind of why this place is so special. And so then what we did is that we wanted to create a model to say, these are the soils conditions for these sites, and we want to then apply that to the rest of the state. So the way that we did that was we said, well, let's use a portion of those sites to create our model, but we'll hold some back in order to be able to then make sure that our model works. So we randomly selected 70%, 109 of those 156 locations. So like I say, the larger share was in order to basically say, these are the conditions that support these pine bush and sandplain type, pine barren and sandplain ecosystems. And then we double checked our model with the remaining 30%. So here was the data that we used for our model. So what we're trying to do is to understand the conditions of known pine barren and sandplain ecosystems. We focused on two things. One was the percent sand, how much sand is there in the soil profile, and the other is how deep is the soil. Now, soil isn't uniform. If you dig a hole starting at the top and go down until you reach bedrock, you're going to go through different horizons. You're going to go through areas where it's going to be, much more influenced by roots and have kind of one set of mixture of sand and silt and clay in the top, and it's going to change as you go down. You're going to have fewer and fewer roots, but the composition of that sand, silt, and clay is going to vary as well. But luckily, the U.S. Geological Survey has data about the composition of our soils all the way through that gradient, all the way down to bedrock. And we were able to use this data in order to be able to, first it tells us what's the depth, and then it tells us across different horizons what the percent sand is along each of those gradients, in each of those horizons. So then we took an average for any particular point to be able to say, well, this is the overall percent sand if you take that whole horizon into account. And this data set by the Geological Survey is spatial in nature. So for any point on the landscape, we can retrieve that information. So for our 109 known high quality barrens and sand plains, we were able to get these two pieces of data, the percent sand and the soil depth to the bedrock. So here now I've graphed those values for those sites. So here we have the soil depth and the percent sand for all 109 locations. So each of these dots is a different preserve, a different remnant pine barren or sandplain ecosystem recognized, but mapped by the New York Natural Heritage Program. And the size of the dot is how big it is. This didn't come out. Oh yeah, I guess you could see it. So it tells you something about how large they are. So the larger circles are the ones that are, larger blocks of land. And you can see several things. One is that most of them are clustered in very deep. So 200 centimeters, 200 meters was the deepest. Yeah, well, it is 200 centimeters is the deepest that it went there. And then we have the percent sand here. And so we have the largest cluster here in the upper right-hand quadrant where where we have both very deep soils, but also very sandy soils. There are some that occur elsewhere, but really the lion's share of them are occurring up there in those two zones. And so what we did was we took the average for all of these data points and said, well, let's extend our cutoff in terms of how deep and how sandy would a soil have to be in order to meet that classification. And we said that it had to be at least 76% sand and at least 160 centimeters deep for it to be able to meet this threshold. So that's our model. That's basically now we've said, we think that around the state, that soils that are at least that sandy and at least that deep have the conditions that could potentially support pine barren sandplain soils. So then we mapped those locations using that U.S. Geological Survey database. We mapped the soils across the state to see where were locations that had soils that were at least that sandy and at least that deep. And so then the final thing, before I show you the map, because that's what's really the fun part about this, but we went back to see how well our model did. Do we trust our model? So remember, we had kept out 30% of our locations and didn't use them to make the model. So we weren't, double dealing and kind of cheating with checking our model with the same data we used to make our model. So this was independent data, and we found that 81% of those remaining sites that we double checked were matched, that they coincided with our map. And that's, pretty good in terms of this kind of project. So we felt comfortable that we were being conservative, that we weren't, and it also worked the other way, that there weren't other kinds of ecosystems that shouldn't be on deep sandy soils that showed up on our map. So we felt like it was a good representation, that our model was something that we could trust. So here's our map. So the blue are lakes, because we all do a better job in terms of orienting ourselves, and we can see the Finger Lakes and see the lakes and rivers. So the Mohawk River is snaking right through here. Here's the Hudson. We're located right here in Albany. And the colors, as I'll show you in a minute, represent different present day land uses. But the orange, green, purple, and pink are all areas of the state that currently have those deep sandy soils. It turned out to be about 9,500 square kilometers of land in the state that had these soils that our model tells us match what the present day sandplains and pine barrens have. That was about 27 times the area of the known locations that the New York Natural Heritage Program has mapped. When you then look and see how do these land covers match out. So 13% of the area is agricultural today. Over half of it, 57%, is forested. Another quarter is urban, and then a scant 4% is open shrubland and grassland. Most likely the kinds of habitats that would support the unique plants and animals that a pine barren and sandplain ecosystem would have, but really very small compared to these other land use types. So you can see here statewide that they're well distributed. About 60% of Long Island is made up of these, and so Long Island is one great big sandbar almost. Then we have large areas here in the Capital Region, the Black River Valley and surrounding the Tug Hill Plateau north of Oneida Lake, and then widely scattered in the North Country as well. So I'm going to focus in on some of these locations in some more detail so that we can see them. So first, let's look at our three of our Capital Region counties. So here I've split out Albany County, Schenectady, and Saratoga County. And we can see our beloved Albany Pine Bush Preserve right here, as well as Schenectady's Woodlawn Preserve and the Wilton Wildlife Preserve. So you may have heard how closely connected all of these ecosystems are, even though they're separated by lots of development, even other kinds of natural habitat. You drive through a lot of forest to get from the Albany Pine Bush Preserve up to the Wilton Wildlife Preserve. And yet, when you look below ground, when you look at the soils, you see that actually it's all one nearly contiguous landscape of these deep sandy soils. So a lot of what you find here in the capital, in the kind of in our area here, are urban. This purple here, the color doesn't match very well here, but this purple here is urban. In Saratoga, we do have the urban land there, but lots and lots of forested land, especially next to the little spur here of Great Sacandaga Lake. A second region in upstate New York, oops, went the wrong way. A second region is in central New York. So here I've Herkimer, Lewis, and Oneida counties. We see a big band along the Black River in the Black River Valley, which corresponds to the edge of the Tug Hill Plateau, as well as north of Oneida Lake in the region of the Rome Sandplains. So there are some preserves here as well, although their open habitat really is not nearly so high quality. Rome Sandplains is excellent, but these other ones actually have relatively small open area, but they, as you can see from their titles, the Ethley Falls Sandplain and the Chase Lake Sandplain, that they really are recognized as being preserves for the purpose preserving these kinds of ecosystems. And then Long Island, as you can see, is, first of all, not surprisingly, lots of it is urban. What areas of shrubland and sandplain grassland that we have are visible here on the Rocky Point Pine Barrens, the Brookhaven Woods, Long Island Pine Barren State Preserve, and so forth. But really would have been a much larger area likely in the absence of all the development and so forth that's taken place on Long Island. So ultimately, what this map tells us is that we're looking, we've revealed really extensive areas of these deep sandy soils that we know support pine barren and sandplain ecosystems, and that potentially may have in the past or could potentially in the future support these ecosystems and the unique plants and animals here. So very little of it, though, is currently open canopy, these widely scattered trees and the open shrubs and so forth, like we have here at the Pine Bush. The vast majority of it is, well, the majority of it is forested, and then another quarter, as I said, is urban. When we contrast that with, this map that I showed earlier, my pinprick picture, we really see, much more of this potential land than what we have. But if we think about it too, as almost like a time machine, that we can understand perhaps how it could be that these ecosystems that are so widely separated from each other have such similarities in terms of the plants and animals that grow there. And it becomes more likely that actually the ones that we have are remnants of what were much more extensive habitats in the past, and that we likely had much larger areas, but also much more widespread across New York. You didn't have these long gaps in between the areas that supported these plants and animals today. Am I saying that I think that all of New York at one point, that all 9,500 square kilometers looked like the Albany Pine Bush does? No, I don't think so. I think it's unlikely that more than a fraction of that at any point in time did, but that it instead provided a potential for shifting of what ecologists call shifting mosaics, a dynamic mosaic, where if you went and you looked across the state at one point in time, you might see some areas that are forested and some that have had a recent fire or other incident that wound up clearing it. But then if you came back at another point in time, decade later, or several decades later, some of those areas might still be forested. Some of those open areas might have transformed to become closed, but others of them would have reopened up. So you would basically have the potential for areas to be open to support the plants and animals in these open ecosystems. And then even if they closed up, others of them would wind up expanding. So at any point in time, there would still be a much more widespread area than just our 350 square kilometers that we today recognize as open pine barren and sandplain ecosystems. This map also tells us something about our geological history. So what all of these locations have in common, or most of them, is that they're areas that have a history of having from the glacial past. So as I said earlier, Long Island is one big glacial moraine that produced the sand down there that supported that today supports those deep sandy soils, or created those deep sandy soils. But the other areas as well, like the Black River Valley and our Albany Pine Bush Preserve, map very closely with our understanding of the melting of the glaciers at the end of the last glaciation. So this map, for example, from 13,500 years ago, shows an expansive Lake Iroquois with its shore matching this Black River Valley bend right there with the sand. And our glacial Lake Albany up into the North Country also matches with these areas and these that ring around the North Country as well. So we can see those glacial deposits in the U.S. Geological Survey's data matching our model, our cutoffs as far as what the soils, the potential soils for these ecosystems. So this is not brand new in the world of habitat management. In fact, this is the 2010 a figure from the 2010 Carner Blue Butterfly recovery plan that was submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it actually lays out the areas of sandy soils and the legacy of the glacial Lake Albany that connects the Wilton Preserve and the Albany Pine Bush Preserve in this regional potential habitat. So they've been taking this into account, this kind of the presence of these sandy soils and the glacial history for some time. But to be able to see it on a statewide basis and expand it beyond the capital region here is what is unique about our study. And so our recognition of, widespread sandy soils nearby the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, nearby other preserves like Wilton or in the Black River Valley or the Rome Sandplains or in Long Island, really point out the opportunities to be able to expand these relatively small preserves and try to allow them to support, to acquire more land and open them up to be able to support the plants and animals that live here. So here at the Albany Pine Bush, as probably most of us are aware, if you've been paying attention as you're driving around over these past couple of decades, that you can remove these forests that have grown up to crowd out the native vegetation, expose that sand, replant the native pine barren vegetation, and then initiate a new cycle of management with prescribed fire or mechanical cutting in order to maintain their open canopies. That supports the plants and the animals here at the Pine Bush. And so the work that, so here, over 500 hectares of forest has been removed from Albany Pine Bush land, creating more habitat for carners and other plants and animals. So this map, for example, shows, it's a little bit out of date now, but shows really the areas of the pine bush that they've been cutting since 1999 up until this map dates from 2015. These purple areas are locust sites here that have since been removed in the Blueberry Hill area. And then this is the Kings Road barren site, which has been removed. I assume it's done being cleared.
I think that's this winter.
Yeah, so it's ongoing or it's been done. So this here is another location that they're removing. So this process of really recognizing these overgrown forests on our sandy soils here within the Albany Pine Bush Preserve area has been recognized for some time. And it's been working. So, should we be doing this? Can we really hope to be able to get the plants and animals back? And the answer is yes. So this is data, for example, from a paper by Neil Gifford, Steve, and Dylan, showing the two things. So the bars, the green bars, are the area of habitat for wild blue lupin. It's potential habitat for Carner blue butterflies. And then the symbols here with the line are the counts of the brood size of the Carner blue butterflies that they measure at 2 points during each summer. So this dotted line right here is the target, the federal recovery target for the Fish and Wildlife Service has set that for the recovery of the Carner blue butterfly. And you can see early on where they had relatively limited open habitat, the Carner blues weren't really doing very well. But as they expanded more and more habitat, the Carner started to do much better. and, have shot way past. I mean, even in this area here, taking this wonderful 2019 value, as, just one year's data point, you can see how they had already for years been above what that recovery target was. So you make more habitat, you get more butterflies. It's worked really well. And so there are opportunities for that elsewhere as well. So the Rome, here in the capital region, the Woodlawn Preserve in Schenectady is now receiving assistance from the Pine Bush Commission to clear invasive species and open up areas and potentially bring back disturbances. And there's also plans to remove forest from Moreau State Park, so as to be able to open up the habitat in an area where Carner blues were seen in the last century, in the 20th century, but they don't live there now. And we may also have the same kinds of opportunities in other parts of New York as well. So in the region of the Rome sandplains or in the Black River Valley, as well as other places as well. So this map really helps us see the potential, not the Albany Pine Bush Preserve and the Wilton Preserve and the Rome sandplains as these unique, isolated little islands, but instead that they're part of a much larger network of these sandy soils that we could try to expand and for the benefit of the plants and animals that live there. So, as we talked about in the very beginning with Don's excellent answer, these pine barrens and sandplains do require deep sandy soils along with periodic disturbances in order to be able to stay open and support the plants and animals. And it's really the glacial activity that wound up giving rise to this. And we can see the match between where those deep sandy soils occur and our understanding of where those glacial lakes and other sorts of glacial activities were in the past. But what our map does is it suggests a much wider distribution of these ecosystems in the past, that these were not small isolated habitats, that they were probably much more extensive and supported a much larger range and population for the Carner blue butterfly, eastern spadefoot toad, and a variety of other plants and animals that live here and nowhere else. But there does suggest to us a much wider opportunity for restoration than really we're currently thinking about, not only within the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, but really in surrounding counties and statewide as well. So with that, I am more than happy to be able to continue this conversation about the pine barrens and sandplains here in New York State and answer any questions you guys might have. Yes.
Did you take into account the origin of the sands, whether they're aeolian windblown versus outwash, the gradation, whether they're fine, like we see in the pine barrens versus, very, well graded, fine to coarse sands that we see in many different places?
Only to the extent that the data enabled us to look at sort of gravel versus sand. So there are certainly gravel deposits that are also associated with these, deposited by these same activities. And that was at a, enough of a particle size for the data to be able to recognize. So, but the answer is no, the data didn't allow us really at that scale to be able, at the statewide scale, to be able to differentiate.
Follow. You mentioned the USGS data. What about the Soil Conservation Service, all their agricultural mapping? They indicate parent material very often, which would help. Well,
my guess is that those are related to each other, that the USGS distributes the gridded surface soil, GSERGO, can't remember what all the acronyms were, but my guess is that data all came from the same place, but I don't know that for sure. That would be an interesting additional place for us to go look.
I look at the web soil survey for some of my work,
Mhm.
and that's partly to actually add to your question, though. I think a lot of times, even locally, they'll just say it's either aeolian, like they won't say specifically, like, oh, this is from this rock formation group on the web soil survey anyway, like the sands we're talking about. But anyway, my question was the 200 centimeter.
Mhm.
Was that a cutoff Like, they didn't.
That was
see
as
it
deep
deeper?
really as it
Yeah,
goes. It's
so
sort
it
of
was a
like
data
beyond
cutoff.
2 centimeters.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
sort of like greater than was. the-
yes,
Yes.
Why do your maps show little forestation in the High Peaks area, the Adirondack Park?
Little forest? No, actually, it was a lot of forest in the High Peaks area. Go back to one where we can see it. That's the largest scale. So most of what we hit, so
Spotty.
oh, well, so my guess is that these are the much smaller. As things were melting, smaller deposits likely in the little valleys. My guess is that these correspond to kind of depressions in the landscape. I thought you were asking about forested, but you're asking about why they're spotty there and not contiguous like this.
Yeah.
So there, one of the first versions that we didn't consider soil depth. We were thinking just about percent sand. And we got a huge swath here in the High Peaks region. And that didn't sound right to us. Because what you've got, if you climb into the High Peaks, the sand may be very sandy, but it's also very thin. That, isn't really what we're looking at here. So as you start to get into the slopes of these areas, the soil gets thinner and thinner. And so that's not appropriate. Even if it may be sandy soil, it's not very deep soil. So it really takes either, river valleys or other sorts of depressions and so forth for the sand to be able to pool in those High Peaks regions. I should say, by the way, that, thin soils like pavement barrens or rocky outcrops and those sorts of places share a lot of the physical, widely scattered trees, shrub understory, and a lot of the same species as well as our sandplain and pine barren soils. But we didn't really look at those, mapping those. That would be a different project to look and see, where are the thin soils like up in Altona and what's the one out here? I want to say Champlain. That's it. Shalamont?
Yeah.
Chameau?
Yeah, Shimon.
Shaman. Anyway, so those pavement barrens are a different origin. They look similar as far as what the landscape physically looks like, the biota looks like, but they arise from a very different thing. So they weren't the part of those 27 ecosystem types that we were looking at. Yes.
Describe how they do a core sample to verify the percentage and the depth.
Yeah, so the mapping at the scale of what they do here is at about 10 meters, I believe, but it is not directly measured. There's no way that the Geological Survey has gone and done that, but they go and they're relying based on satellite photos, for example, in order to look for, points at which soils are changing in part based on vegetation, among other things. And then they go and they have a system by which they're double checking those. They do verify those in order to feel confident, just like we did, that their model is matching. I don't know whether you might have more information about this if you're using these, whether you have a more complete answer to it.
I mean, I'm not working in the uplands, I'm working in the wetlands.
Yeah,
So, but we still use it for like hydric soils, but that's a whole other.
right. But so, basically we're using it for the surface soil. They've also got information about nutrients, pH, flooding risks. There's a whole host of different ways that folks use this. It's important for developers to understand what's there. And so we didn't really go and try to verify their data. We really were just relying on the data that keeping, hoping that they had done their jobs in
Right.
terms of making reliable data.
Okay, thanks.
Jeff, focusing on the Black River Valley. So what do you think, in your opinion, in your imagination, how did that evolve from those receding glaciers to to the point where it is now? What sort of, based on, you know, that it
So
was a
glacial,
sandy area, how do you think it evolved to?
so just as the Albany pine bush was on the edge of glacial Lake Albany and basically was the point at which the waters came flowing down what is now the Mohawk River and kind of slowed down and deposited their sand into a location. Likewise, this area here is on the edge of what would have been glacial Lake Iroquois. So glacial Lake Iroquois extended much farther inland than the present day Lake Erie does. And so it's on the eastern shore of that. My guess is that that was either due to dune formation or the drainage patterns, that basically that arc right there, I think matches very closely with that. So as it was receding, you know, the sands, the sand in the lake wound up pooling there to a greater extent than it did further east. Now, you know, the Tug Hill Plateau rises up and actually is kind of at a higher, almost like a mesa at that point to the west. So it could be that, you know, something related to that.
Yeah, one of the things that happens, these lake levels, they're not constant. Okay, that might be like the maximum.
Right.
As the lake level drops, you have a lot of shoreline that's very desiccated.
Yeah.
And westerly winds blow all that sand off.
Mhm.
The silt probably goes farther, but the sand. It's
Yeah.
very interesting that it lines up along the.
Yeah.
Questions?
I'd just like to point out that it's interesting from our perspective, because we know the historic range of the Carter Blue, for example, goes all the way west to south of the Great Lakes. So we know that this historically occurred all there, and so we knew there had to be something there that had these things connected.
Because how did this very small
that only moves 200 meters,
butterfly get from here to the Midwest? And-
right? How are those populations connected? And this sort of helps us understand, like, oh, okay, maybe there was all these linkages along the way that basically like connect them to all these from here to the range to the Midwest.
Yeah.
And those are obviously now gone, and there's a way that I think they could disperse that way now, because as you've shown, there's just like these little dots of habitat that they can no longer get to on their own.
And there might be some places like the Albany pine bush that would have been semi-permanent, that fires were frequent enough and that a population could establish a long-standing, you know, range inside of. But there may have, you know, my point about the shifting mosaic is that there might have been other ones scattered along here where some sort of wind blow, some sort of fire or something like that might have opened up some areas, and then it wound up creating appropriate habitat for a matter of decades or you know, longer. But then if the disturbance didn't come back, if it didn't reburn, then forests would come back in and close up. Butterflies and other plants and animals might have been there for a time, but then they would have wound up moving over to some other area that opened up somewhere else. When you start to have a lot of land that is potential, you don't worry so much about, you know, a few jewels the way we do now with so few habitat left now. So you wouldn't have worried so much, oh, you know, well, so we lost a 3,300 acre area called the Albany pine bush. That's okay, because there's another one over there in those days. Today it would be, you know, just a tragedy to lose it, because there is no other place like this on our landscape.
I've had a question for a long time. The Great Plains, to change the subject. Why didn't that get forested? How come it stayed as prairies and plains? Is
It has to do with the dry, yeah, so it's dry enough that you get enough fires that trees don't grow well there. So the precipitation in those regions is significantly, you know, lower than it is in the deciduous forest region. Along the kind of borderline between the tall grass prairie biome and the deciduous forest, that I'm sure moved, that you could have the forest creep in, you could have the prairie, you know, come back and take more area. But looking kind of at the center of each of those, it had mostly to do with the rate of precipitation.
I would say bison also had a
Grazing,
big effect.
great point as well. So fire and grazing collectively would have kept out a lot of the, would have prevented trees from being able to. Come in. Great. Thanks, everybody. All right. Thank you.
Thinking is